break down heavy ideas into small buckets anyone can handle. Our mission is simple: to work through our differences and collaborate with others through conversation and processes. Together, we can face our dilemmas and make our world a better place for everyone.
In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge we are in Blackfoot Treaty 7 territory and Métis Districts 5 and 6 lands. We take reconciliation by seeking the wisdom of elders and individuals who aim to restore water, air, land, life, and community. A healthy living relationship with our homeland and each other is our guide. Okay, so I'm going to say a quick welcome, but Alex is going to lead us off today.
Last time we spoke with Regan, we spoke about sourcing news and the importance of being able to fact check and back check information that may be sort of advertised in the mainstream, and also how there are discrepancies in terms of interprovincial media. Some things will be overly reported in Alberta and underreported in Central Canada and Eastern Canada. Some things will be overly reported in Central and Eastern Canada that are underreported in Western Canada. So we see these bifurcations in terms of information that people are being flooded with, and it leads to these miscommunications. So what we're setting out to do in this second conversation is based on the previous one and that understanding. We're trying to ask you, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, is there anything that you've discovered since in terms of being able to source media and where the discrepancies in communication are and where there is a lack of information that the general public and population has access to?
Well, these are the issues, these discrepancies that I started to come across in my research 25 years ago, or what motivate me and interest me. And there's so many to uncover. They're everywhere. But I have started to see a pattern to how much is missing and how systematically different things work. Over time, you see these patterns. And the biggest insight that I've had is I've studied these kind of the shadows, the taboo subjects so much that you realize how big a part they are of the world. Whether we think about them or know about them or not, there's trillion-dollar infrastructures in many countries all setting to work on these things for many decades, and they have an accumulated impact, an invisible force that if we can start to make sense of, I would say that force has grown to such we can't make sense of the world without appreciating what's not there, the missing pieces. And that's my biggest and inadvertent insight is I've studied these taboo subjects. I found some issues that are genuinely censored. And so we know that they're not there at all. The way that they do that, one of the main ways they censor things is they keep the dates out. When I started to look back at the history books, even the history books in Canada had the strange thing. When I went to go look for important events, they wouldn't include the date. Or I'd have to check 4 different sources and find in a footnote on page 800 that there would be the date and how difficult it would be. And I realized that's one of the main tools to keep us confused, is to not have things in chronological order where things make evolutionary sense. And the biggest research insight I've had in the last year is taking all these facts I gather from all these different and simply putting them in chronological order. And it makes it perfect. It doesn't take anything more than common sense that any roofer has, that you can see quite clearly what's happening. And so if your theory of the world, if your worldview doesn't include the unknown, but in a way that can factor it in and help explain it, then if you're just floating on the surface, you can't help but be confused. You can't help but be led by the nose into the next. You have to have some sort of bigger understanding and realizing how they do that, just obscuring dates. And what that's basically come down to, my biggest insight is that there's no truth without context. That any fact or any date or anything, you put it over here and it means nothing. You put it in its context, it could mean everything. And that's the main trick of the media, of concision, of now it's over. I gotta go. Next one. You can't think.
It normalizes. Yeah, it makes everything equally important and doesn't, like you said, help us understand that context. In fact, Alex and I were having a conversation yesterday about, something Jordan Peterson spoke about, which was the changes in temperature related to concrete, right? You know how when people talk about temperature sensors on the earth, well, there used to not be concrete there, and therefore we can ignore it because now there's concrete. Well, but no, the context of that is the concrete is part of the warming. That's a whole part of our addition to that. And so that's an example, I think, of what you're describing of this, the lack of context in what he's saying, so that people can ground that in, yeah, that's absolutely true. And also that's part of the cumulative impact problem that we have, and the temperature rising based on those activities. So it's that context.
Yeah, like we need those sensors in urban areas, especially because we need to know how much this heat bubble created by all this asphalt and all this concrete is affecting the stratosphere, and how storms behave and where they move, because like if you create a microclimate like this heat bubble over top of a city, then you'll see, and I've seen it because I've lived in Calgary my whole life. We used to get wicked storms in the Northwest, and now they all just like split around the city, and they go to the urban or the rural areas around the city. So the storms actually just split because of this unnatural environment that the cities have actually created.
Yeah, perfect example.
So I've been watching the jet stream, and I've been like,
We
for
can't just
42
be
years
dismissed
now, and
with a wave of the hand.
right, so it's
Alex hasn't heard your backstory. I know I heard it when you went on Ryan Jesperson, but can you just remind us and our audience why you've gone down this research path that you have? I recall you had a well on your family's land. I thought that's how this started. If you can just give us a little bit of your history, it'd be awesome.
There's a well on my grandpa's farm that came at a much later date, came in with the current premier. But I grew up in northern Alberta in Grand Prairie, and my dad was a heavy-duty mechanic with Nowsco, working in the oil patch during the boom up there in the 70s and 80s. We moved to Calgary when I was in high school, and when I started getting interested in school and studies, eventually I went into started in journalism and started reading newspapers, and that's where I got hooked on this disconnect between what I'd read in the newspapers. I'd see something interesting, see something happen, I'd go and try to learn more about it. And there was always a huge disconnect between the scholarly study, the history, and the way the story was being told in the paper. And it was a constant disconnect that I ended up studying international relations and the Middle East and Canadian foreign policy. And I worked in the oil patch during the summer when I was going to university on a service rig out of Brooks, living in my van outside a friend's trailer, learning about how things worked in the field, and got to ask lots of questions and got more curious. And after I finished grad school and I moved back to Alberta, I thought I should study the oil and gas industry. It's obviously so big and important. I wasn't aware of anybody seriously looking at it. And so I started poking around, started volunteering with the Parkland Institute at the University of Alberta, just kind of sharing research and contributing. There was a royalty review in 2007. Turned out to be, I didn't appreciate how unique a moment it was in Alberta, where there was a real genuine public debate. There was a government genuinely committed to trying to raise royalties, had set the scene and took a run at it. And it was an incredible time where there was a real genuine public debate. And that's what kind of got me hooked on. I was doing research for a service company in the oil patch at the time. I started working on the royalty review and get onto something, get a little bit of understanding about the industry and that disconnect. It's so huge when it comes to oil and gas. And working for the Parkland, I started studying the economics of the oil and gas industry. They'd asked me to look at quarterly reports to try to figure out how much money the companies were making, and it turned out to be impossible to tell who makes money where, let alone try to add it up. But I found industry statistics where the federal government makes them report their costs and their revenues. And I'm not an economist, and I'm just silly enough that if I subtract those two, doesn't that tell me how much profit they have? Or couldn't I figure that out? And I didn't even know how to use a spreadsheet, but I typed in all the numbers by hand and quadruple checked them, and then Parkland sent it to professors in Norway and elsewhere, and turned out it was right. The profits were really that big. No real explanation why or why no one else was studying it, but there was enormous profits being made. And we published that. It makes news across the province. Every newspaper, radio station, TV reports it. And the next day, it's gone. It's like it never happened. It's never mentioned again. Nobody mentions it. Nobody seems curious or wonders why we give away so much money. And it's a target-rich environment here in Alberta. And I happened to start poking around in the oil industry, and there's just so many skeletons in the closet. I've never stopped poking around, never stopped accumulating this data and all of these facts, never stopped questioning, because it makes no sense. Who would do this to themselves? Who would give away 95 cents of every dollar that comes out of the ground? Why don't we make them clean up stuff? Those are the questions that have puzzled me for decades. I'm still trying to make sense of them, still trying to answer those questions. Whether or not I have an answer, all those things are true. Just can't ignore them. I can't forget them. I can't pretend I don't know these things. I'm trying to find the string of logic that ties them all together and explains them all. Because if we do, that amount of money that's coming out of the ground in Alberta is more than enough to take care of everybody, solve all of our problems. It's absolutely enormous. That, combined with the financial capacity it gives us to finance an equivalent amount of our wealth at any given time, if there was some way we could bring that under democratic control, if there's some way we could have the rule of law, that's
man, I think that there's a lot of hope there, right? Like, I just finished listening to you speaking with Mark Doran about the Orphan Fund, and I find it ironic that the Orphan Fund was kind of created by the oil and gas industry and ratified into law by the provincial government. So everyone sat down and then agreed that the Orphan Fund would provide a safety net in terms of reclamation and restoration of land to usability. But there's like 4,700 wells that have just been abandoned, and they were abandoned by companies that have since folded and filed for insolvency. And then it ends up these orphans are just kind of left to be repaired on the taxpayer's dime. When 90%, 95% of that money that was made by these producers was just taken out of the optionality, right? Like nothing was actually put back into that safety net. And what's interesting is we don't even need any, as you were saying, we don't even need any new laws. We don't even need any new legislation. The laws
just need to uphold them.
Yeah, we just need to enforce them, right? Like,
and I can offer from somebody who was in industry. So, I was in industry for 22 years, and the story that you hear is if we charge more, they'll leave. As a geoscientist that knows the quality of our oil and the difficulty of like how little volume we get from wells, you get convinced that because of those, lower quality things and those difficult choices, that if we say no, they'll go somewhere else. If we ask for more, they're gone. And so, and I'll stop after this, Regan, and we'll let you dive into the history at this point. But to me, the thing that's lingering, like you said, I experienced this too, where it seems there's things that are super obvious, and then when you actually get down to it, it's never actually meant to happen. That's what it appears like, right? Like we've done this safety net, but we're going to make it as impossible as possible to actually pull the trigger on that safety net. So that's the impression I have, and I'm sure you can say it better than I just did. Go ahead.
No, you're both right about there's some of the quirks of Alberta's history that here in the practical world of where are we, do we go, two of our biggest advantages are there was a period in the 70s and 80s where we had a real committed patriotic local government that wrote all those wonderful laws that are still there on the books that give the remedies for each citizen in each scenario. We knew this stuff. We have the best law. They're sitting there. They've fallen out of use. It's not being enforced today. And instead, there's a charade. There's a regulatory facade up in front of that. A nice curtain. Say, don't look behind the curtain. We have a very nice curtain here. We can assure you it's a very nice curtain. Don't look behind it. And it looks wonderful.
Best regulations in the world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Best laws, most
Yeah.
responsible, right? That's the curtain, right?
Interestingly, though, that they would be if they were actually just enforced.
And so that's the low-hanging fruit. That's the jujitsu that we could turn their charade against them. They want to pretend it's real. Let's do it. It does look great. We can do it. And what are they going to say about it? We don't have to listen to their complaints. They designed it, it's theirs. And then those same laws that are hiding there, unused, unremembered, like the Orphan Fund. It's unique in Alberta. And this is one of those disconnects. Everyone hears about orphans all the time. Then what? How do all these guys get to just walk away from this mess? And how is in every state and province across North America? How is it the taxpayers? Why is there? It makes no sense.
Alberta, it's the insolvency thing, right? They just,
exactly. You wait till it's too late.
We are different.
Too late.
Yeah.
But not all of us were born yesterday. There's some people somewhere that have some. It's not, and Alberta fixed it, at least on the surface. We have one of those charades. We have the Orphan Fund, where one of the first curtain they put up before we had the charade of regulatory programs. The first curtain was, we'll have a fund. You don't need to enforce the law. You don't need to regulate us. We'll have a fund. And later, when stuff happens, we'll pay for it. So you don't need to worry about it. So we have this fund, and that's our safety net. And that's unique in the world. It's unique in North America. Everyone else, it falls to the taxpayers. What are you going to do? Here it falls to the taxpayers. What do? We say, pay up today. You got 4,700 orphans. The industry, according to the law, is supposed to pay for 4,700 orphans now. It's your system. You designed it. You implemented it. It's time. And now they make up stories and they whine they can't do it. There's no money. They don't want to. But it's there. We could use it against them. That law is sitting there. That's our safety net. That's what we should be calling for. But we can't get any journalists to mention it. We can't get the law professors to admit that it's there. We can't get them to read that section out loud. That we read English. That's what it means. No one's allowed to talk about it. And that's one of the clues. And that's how you know you're onto something. All of this stuff, this shadow, the unknown, the way you know you're onto something is that disconnect. If they say they're trying to do something and they design a system to do something, and then it doesn't do that, and they don't say it, and nobody even mentions it, nobody has a problem with it, it's just, there you go. That's it. You're on to something right there. That disconnect.
There's also something really important that you're touching on there, Regan, in terms of potential job creation, right? Like if we can hold these companies
$260 billion economy,
right? Just in reclamation and restoration, and like bringing these wells, capping them properly, responsibly, preventing the leakages, restoring the land to usability and functionality, preventing the leaks, all those types of things. There's huge money to be made, right? In this restoration, right? Like
so many people employed, and like people like myself. It's one thing I test with my friends in the industry is I say I'll come back in the industry in a heartbeat if I can be focused on cleanup and reclamation. I would
Right.
love to
Yeah,
map
everybody would.
contamination instead of mapping a reservoir for the 100th time, right?
Yeah.
I would love to be deciding where we should be protecting water and where we should be investing in our eastern slopes, for example. Absolutely, Alex. The
Like,
one example
wouldn't
I
that be a
touched on
funny
at
thing
first,
if we could convince these rich folks that they could make even more money and do the right thing at the same time?
There is a
yeah,
Wow.
huge market for that. There's
Yeah.
so true.
everyone below the producers. You have the license
Mhm,
holders who take the
mhm,
revenue. That's a tiny fraction, but the vast majority of employment, the vast majority of jobs is in the service sector, which is cleanup.
mhm.
And so, irrespective of production, whether we're responsible or not, whether we being responsible means we don't have production in 10 years, regardless of all that, there's the same amount of cleanup. It's going to cost the same amount of money. It's going to create the same amount of jobs. And so just committing to polluter pay means full employment in the oil and gas sector in Alberta for decades, no matter what.
Decades.
Whoever wants
Yep.
a job has a job, a good job. We can make
Good
them
job.
fantastic jobs. We can make them local. We can make them reasonable. We can make them safe.
Yeah.
There's more than enough money. We're not idiots. It could all be done
Yeah.
Yes.
at no cost. This is Mother Nature's bounty. This is money that comes out of the ground.
Mhm.
If we stop giving it away to foreign shareholders, if we stop using it in the public interest, there's no more austerity. There's no.
Yeah.
I grew up in Alberta in the 70s and 80s when we were building roads, building hospitals. It was hope and progress. And ever since I've come of age, since Klein in the 90s, it's been austerity and decline. And I look at the oil and gas. I look at the numbers. I don't understand the disconnect, and nobody's interested. You're not allowed to talk about it. It
Well,
makes it more difficult, but it's a hint that you're onto something important.
Well, no one was
yeah.
interested in the smartphone, right? Like BlackBerry was humming and hawing about, no one wants a touch screen. No one wants a touch screen. And Steve Jobs came along and he was like, everyone wants a touch screen. So he came out with the smartphone and it completely revolutionized that industry. So if we can look at cleanup and restoration with the same,
As a
no one's
smartphone.
talking about it, which means that we're headed in the right direction if we start, right?
Yeah.
Allies in the industry, everyone below the
Yeah.
producer, all the locals, this is their only future. If we stick
Right.
to the dregs, there's nothing left for the little guys. Cleanup
Correct.
is their only future, but
Yeah, and it's all of ours.
they're not in
So,
charge.
Regan, can you take some time now and just back up for us and offer who are the problem owners? Like, can you offer how did we get here? Like, I know you touched on we had Lougheed, we had the Lougheed years, we had where we actually had responsible development and a plan for the future, the highest royalty rates. But can you give us, from your perspective, what are kind of the key decision points in Alberta's history that you think we need to be aware of if we're somebody that's coming in and wanting to know how are we giving away 95% of our resource? If that is something that you can highlight for us.
Well, the royalties are somewhat of a mystery. Alberta has the lowest royalty rates on earth. And we had a royalty review in 2015, and we lowered them further. And it's not really up for debate. The numbers are pretty clear. But when it comes to cleanup, that wasn't an issue until more recently. In the old days, when it was just big companies, there was nobody going broke and disappearing. That was kind of a more modern development in the 70s and 80s when local companies started developing, and then the prices crashed in 85. That's when we were first faced with this issue of cleanup, and nobody really knew what to do or how to do it. And they put aside some money for orphan wells, and they struggled with pipeline accidents. But eventually, whether it was genuine or not, whether it was a charade or not, the system they came up with is still the right system. It's focused on solvency. And so to protect against industry running its course and there being no money left at the end of the game to pay for cleanup, the way they were going to control that is when the way you get there is you sell wells to some little guy who's not going to have the capacity to clean them up later. And so the first thing we did was try to control those license transfers. There've been very few rules, very few controls, but starting in 1989, when you wanted to sell wells, they would pause and take a look at the health of the companies and make sure you weren't just dumping something in a shell that was going to end up in taxpayers. And so that sort of monitoring is absolutely essential because of the nature of the game. There's no money for the mess at the end, so you got to keep an eye on them. And so that approach is what we should be doing. We expanded it in 2000, and we had a system that monitored each well and their production and their profitability and their life, so we could collect everything ahead of time. And so that's still the way we should do it. It's monitoring solvency is the only way to do it. And the benefit of that is you're monitoring the profits, so you can also calculate the excess profits, all the extra money that the industry didn't earn, and they don't own the oil and gas. That belongs to the citizens in Alberta, so those extra profits belong to the public. And that's what we can fund a decent society with, is the resource rent of our resources. It's enormous. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year in Alberta that gets transferred to mostly foreign shareholders for nothing. Like the oil sands, just think about it for a moment. What do we do with all of our American dollars? We must have so many American dollars. There's all these American companies here. They're buying all of our oil. What do we do with? There's no American dollars. We don't have an American dollar. Like there's not one American dollar. They don't invest here.
So do you think that like sort of a pay it forward type thing, like if you're going to be extracting our resources and capitalizing on them and then kind of leaving a mess, like should there be sort of like, well, it's going to cost you this much in like corporate citizenry, you're going to have to invest in infrastructure, you're going to have to invest in building something up within our province so that we have the opportunity as a people to have better hospitals, have better schools, have better things. Like should there be sort of like a corporate citizenship fund that they have to pay forward if they want to extract from us, right?
One way or the other. There's one source of money. It's our oil and gas that's coming out of the ground, and the choice is, how do we share it? Do we leave it all in industry's hands and beg them to be nice boys and girls and to do some nice things for us? Or do we collect our money when it comes out of the ground and we decide what we'd like to do with it as a democratic society and go ahead and do it? Right now, our
kind of like
system is
the
leave it
latter.
in their hands. But the same thing applies to cleanup. We can ask or demand industry to clean it up. They don't have any money in the bank. They have tomorrow's revenue, same as us, to pay for it. And so we can either make industry pay for cleanup, or we can simply just collect all of the profit at extraction, give them a return on their investment, and we can use it to pay for cleanup. Because whether we make them do it or we pretend like we nationalize it and we just clean it up ourselves, it's the same pile of money coming out of the same holes. And we have enough experience. I think we should be pretty cautious about the good faith of industry, whether we can rely on them for anything, let alone something so important, and get over
is something that I've expressed to you in the past when we've talked about the industry. The way the regulations are written, in my view, say that they want to hand over the keys. Like when you read the regulations, it says when, as you said, when the LLR, so let me back up and explain that what that was, but there was a licensee liability rating. They looked at the asset value, which was a simple linear calculation, which is a little bit problematic in itself, but a calculation of asset value, 3 years production estimate, $38 net back. And that's your calculation of your asset value versus this Directive 11 values, which is, we know at Regan's work, and you can talk about ADLP, that is 4 times lower than what it should be in terms of representing the actual liability. So we have this great formula, and when you read the regulation, it says when this asset value reaches this liability value, we stop. We take the keys and we collect deposits. That's how it's written. They want to give deposits. It never says anywhere in the regulation that the oil companies are actually going to do the closure work. It says the regulator needs to take deposits at that point, or the orphan steps in, the orphan program, excuse me, and that gets taken over that way. But either way, none of it suggests that the oil companies want to have a plan and are ready to do this reclamation work. Do you see it differently?
Yeah, the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project
Okay.
is a group of stakeholders, academics and environmental groups and landowners that got together trying to estimate the cleanup involved with oil and gas. And
Okay.
our estimates started coming out in 2019. Started making use of some of this data to try to inform the debate around how much is actually going to be involved in cleanup. But that is what the LOL program did. It monitored solvency. But that tells you how strange the regulator is operating, that at the point of insolvency, when the debts equal the assets, when there's $0 left, that's when you mail them a bill.
Yeah.
How's that
And
working out for
we
you?
get that perfectly
Yeah.
right in a market that we know does this in terms of prices on a given day. You know, people come back to life in a $10 swing. You know, like it's, to me, that's when I was joking earlier. I put out a tweet talking about this discussion and said, you know, this perfect instance where the regulator is just going to go, oh, thank you. On this day is when we decide that, you know, well, let's pick a company. Obsidian. Like right now, we have a real company that's on the verge of bankruptcy and is looking, you know, to develop still. It owes some money to some I don't know if it's shareholders or contractors, and now there's an environmental concern potentially from cutting corners. You know, I'm speculating here, but these are the real life issues that are happening because of the regulator not stepping in and saying it's time for us to take the keys and make sure that these assets are back with you know, Albertans, I guess, ultimately, if, you know, whether it's held by the provincial government on our behalf. Do you have any thoughts on that, Regan? Like what it would look like for you, and if they were to pull the trigger, what you would expect to see? Or is that just, you know, details at this point?
Well, we've run the numbers. We've calculated the solvency and projected the solvency for every license in Alberta. Vast majority of them are already gone, well past the point. So there's very few companies holding anything of any real value. They're just operating outside of the law, outside of economics. And if we enforce the rule of law, hundreds and hundreds of companies would disappear. That's portrayed as something bad. It isn't at all. They're robbing us, every one of them, every day, every dollar they spend or do. They're just robbing from us, creating a bigger mess that they're going to leave for us. And so them shutting down is a good thing. And it doesn't lead to less jobs, it leads to more jobs because of the cleanup. It doesn't matter how we have the Orphan Fund. We have Section 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. Industry has to pay for them. So these companies failing isn't a bad thing if we have the rule of law, because the only thing that makes it a bad thing is because there's an obstacle that the regulator doesn't assign obvious orphan wells that don't have a viable owner to the Orphan Fund. And the reason they don't do that is because once they're there, industry is supposed to pay for them to be cleaned up. And so
Okay.
if
So in
we
terms
had
of who's who in the zoo, like who's lining their pockets? Like
it's
in the regulatory commission, like who's greasing
it's a
their
problem. It's a
wheels so they
problem.
look the other way, right?
It's a problem across North America. It's absolute standard operating procedure across North America. The way they pocket the money and leave it for taxpayers is you sell garbage to a crappy little company, and he may run on fumes for a couple months, a couple years, and then he'll disappear. And he's the guy holding the bag, and he's the only one you're allowed to look at. And that happens because the regulators, as a rule, across North America, rubber stamp every license transfer. I can sell 4,000 wells to my mother-in-law for $1. Rubber stamp, approved. If my mother-in-law goes bankrupt, she's a villain. Put her picture in the paper. And CAP will say we need to go after these little guys. The problem is that transfer, and it's not just here. It's an industry stand, and that's actually the root of the problem. We don't control those license transfers. We could, we should, we have. We know how. It's not complicated, but we don't. That's strange, but it leads directly to this consequence that we have all these stones with no blood to pay for anything, but it's not a mystery. And the sort of data that the regulator has that should all be public in the public interest, we could trace all that. We could trace the history of every one of these
100%.
companies, every one of these wells. We know every dollar, every person made from every well every year. And we could go down the list, pay up, pay up, pay up. The law's on our side. It's totally doable. Those companies are
Yeah, so I'm going to
society.
expand on that a little bit for you. So I recall that the expiry on lookbacks is 2 years in Alberta legislation. So what I mean by that is you can only look back for 2 years, and by the time most transactions are through the regulator, a company's operating and actually through their initial capital is 2 years. So essentially, anybody can pretty well stay afloat for 2 years. So if you hand something down, then they've got 2 years to basically hold on to it. And if they make it through those 2 years, then there's no prior owner, according to the way the law is written. Is that correct, Regan?
From an accounting perspective, in bankruptcy, there is a 3-year look back, and so that's 3 years is a popular timeline for a number of things in the oil patch for just such a reason. So if you want to stop paying all your bills, your company's running to the ground, you can also get away for a few years not paying your property taxes. You can just stop paying those. Nobody's gonna, just 3 years, you can put that money in your pocket and then go bankrupt. Just add it to the bill. That same sort of thing is happening.
Yeah, that's true. That's the property taxes or the surface lease rentals. Those are the ways that companies can get away.
As far as the law goes, we can look backwards. We can't look to previous owners. We do know who they are, and they are supposed to look for them. We know from Freedom of Information requests, the regulator doesn't look backwards. They don't try to go after old people. They don't try to look them up and find the previous owner, even if we know who they are, even if there's somebody huge with buttloads of money. They never look backwards because they promised not to in 1991. And that's the root of it. If you never look backwards, you sell it to a sucker, no blood from a stone.
And then buyer beware, right? It was always buyer beware.
How many millions of times are we going to be told that story before we wise up? The stakes are pretty high. Taxpayers will be on the hook. We're not this.
Also, just the little guys, who are actually trying to do something good, or start a business or whatever, and they buy these liabilities in good faith, right? And they end up trying to make a good go, and they end up being on the front page taking responsibility for regulatory arbitrage and corruption that supersedes anything that they were even aware of remotely, right? So they're really like squishing the little guys trying to make a go of things. And I think that's that. If anything's criminal, it's that.
And it gives us, and it puts the rest of us to sleep. It gives the facade of accountability, the facade of somebody cares, somebody's paying, and we can move on. But
yeah, it's not the whole story.
And we don't have time for anything that doesn't get to the root of any problem. There's no, we can't. That's part of the trick. If we just play around and waste our time, we lose. If we're distracted, time is the central.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, to me, it's not just about reform, because we have I'm a part of a group, when Reagan's a part of a group that's looking at a regulatory reform, trying to make sure that we have a regulator that is actually representing the public to some degree. It's supposed to be at least a different, at arm's length from the industry and arm's length from the government, right? So we don't have that separation between those three entities that we're supposed to have. Instead, they're all sort of in the same bucket working with each other rather than understanding those separation of responsibilities.
I think one of those scary realities too is that if you get a regulator who's actually willing to regulate the laws that are already on the books, they're going to go the way of Serpico. I don't know if you've ever seen that film, right? Where it was a cop who actually enforced the laws that were on the books. And everyone called him a rat because he couldn't be bought, right? And they were all going against him because he couldn't be corrupted, he couldn't be bribed, he couldn't be bought, he couldn't be bullied, he couldn't be negotiated with when it comes to skirting the law. He was actually there to serve a specific function, which was the laws that were on the books, and they killed him for it in the end. And history's littered with examples of these people who are actually just trying to do the right thing and enforce the laws that are on the books, and properly represent the people, right? They get squashed. Sometimes they get assassinated, or they get their reputation smeared. That's the name of the game these days with social media. Let's just sling mud and destroy a person's reputation so they'll never work again. You know what I mean? Those like scarlet letter. They just throw scarlet letters at people who aren't going to play ball. And this is a really, really challenging environment to actually be in when you're just simply trying to set out to enforce the laws that already exist and properly represent the people who need respectful and accurate representation, who deserve it, right? Be it landowners, be it small companies, be it mom and pop stores that are trying to make a go of it, be it, polluter pay foundations or anything like that. It seems as though there's a construct that goes on sort of behind that veil, that curtain that we're being presented with, that's constantly trying to stifle good people from trying to do the right thing. And I'm not sure if there's a way around it or through it, but I think lifting those veils slowly is helping like in the process anyways, because it's like eventually you see the little guy running the illusion, on the machine behind the curtain, and you discover that he's not that powerful after all. He's just a small little dude with a big shadow, and I think there's more people reaching that state of critical mass where there's like a general openness to maybe understanding that these games have been played against us for much too long. It's time to put a stop to it. GameStop.
Absolutely. This is a moment in history where that is catching on like wildfire everywhere. It's a huge opportunity and a danger that there's two sides, two ways of the political spectrum that could break. It's an opportunity for change. It's an opportunity for critical insight, and things are unstable. There's a chance for change.
Mm-hmm.
Change isn't always good. It can go in a couple of directions, and it's an opportunity that we need to seize on, to make the best of, because there are big opportunities, and the stakes are big, but it's that understanding, and with a little bit of context, it's really hard to find these days, and the vitriol makes it really hard to step anywhere outside of your safety zone. That's the point. But that's what citizens need. They need the access to information so they can figure out what their interests are, and they need to be able to have the confidence to engage in stuff. But I don't know where you find that information anymore. That has been so fragmented from authoritative news, books, magazines, of standards that you couldn't. It was simpler to make sense of some of the bigger things than it is today. But it is that background and that confidence that you're going to need, because the world's hard enough to figure out. The natural world is hard enough to make sense of. But in the human world, there's a whole layer of bad faith and manipulation and power distorting everything that's complicated enough on top of that. But appreciating and understanding it, I've come to appreciate something really amazing about reformers 200 years ago, before all this math stuff, to deal with the complexity of the world and go back to class interest and breaking the society up into different classes that have different interests because of different sources of income. And it's actually an incredible way to simplify really complicated math that we do today to deal with that complexity and the distribution. But it's a really simple way to group things into meaningful, and then you can see their shape and their size and their relation to each other over time. And you can see the rentier part of the piece grow in size and power and influence. And it's a really good shorthand for understanding different part and what those different interests, capitalists and rentiers and laborers, what they have as a group is a certain sort of logic that motivates their interests and their behavior, that certain things benefit them, so they're going to tend towards. And capitalists and rentiers, they have different interests that they go in different directions. And that's a really good shorthand for making sense of the world. When you see people talking in the media and they're all going to look good and sound good and say nice things, it's all going to sound good. But if you have some sense of the interests, some sort of the logic that kind of drives them through the world, you can take it with a better grain of salt. You can maybe know what they're after or why they're those sort of, you need some sort of way to make sense of the world. And just thinking that crudely of just basic interest is a really good filter to cut away, because everything looks so good these days.
It's funny
Yeah.
too, like in that you recognize the patterns. Like I think one thing that I've noticed in our previous conversation and in watching your conversation with Mark and having this conversation right now is you're very good at recognizing patterns, and there's another shorthand I discovered pattern wise too. It's like, okay, the Romans took over the world with roads. They developed trade routes, shortcutting the continent essentially, so that they could trade spices and goods with the East and bring them back and stuff like that, right? And then the British did the same thing with the Navy, right? So then they started bringing pirate ships through the Mediterranean, through the Gulf of Aden, through the Gulf of Oman, right? And into the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, and they would trade spices so they didn't have to go all the way around Africa, right? And now, flashing forward, the same region is still fighting over the same trade routes. So we've been fighting the spice wars for almost 500 years. But all of a sudden now, in today's 24-hour news cycle, it's new. We're fighting the same war. Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great was after those shortcuts, those trade routes. Everyone since the dawn of recorded history was after the same region.
Those tricks, those hacks, the big jumps forward. Yeah. And I've discovered one. The British had one, a financial trick. And I've discovered that Alberta is at the heart of the Americans. Very similar trick. Imperialism is not all about smashing some guy over the head and taking his stuff. Gets a lot more sophisticated over time. It's financial. And financial crimes are tricks, mostly of timing. That's why economists can't do time. They would see all the crimes. But the British greatest trick ever, the way they literally just stole $40 trillion from India with a piece of paper called a bill of goods. They would go to India and they would take your stuff. Instead of paying you money, they give you a bill of goods. You say you take that to your local tax office and they'll give you some rupees. You don't worry, he's there, he's got the rupees, and it's 64 rupees, you'll go get it, you'll get your 64 rupees. Stop. That's the crime. They've been robbed. What happened was the British have your stuff and they've left. And you don't have any of their money, and they'll sell your stuff and they'll have the silver and they'll take that back to Britain and spend it. And what you have is the piece of paper that you take to your local office, and he pays you with yesterday's tax revenue. And so
And if you want
We
to go
gave this,
contest it, you have to go to Britain. It's going to cost you 264 rupees, but they only paid you 64. So
and they didn't. It wasn't even, nobody even figured out until like 100 years after it was over. But they stole $40 trillion in that way.
Yeah.
The very same thing is happening here, and it's so simple. It doesn't even make sense. We don't even see it. But if you stop and think about it, every dollar we lend to an oil company is just straight theft. Every dollar we give them, and this year it's $140 billion. Canadian banks, because of the way banking actually works in the real world, they create $140 billion out of thin air. They hit a button on their keyboard, and $140 new billion show up in oil companies' bank accounts. And they say, thank you very much. We're going to buy back some shares. We're going to pay some dividends. And there's a big debt that has to be repaid. And it's repaid with tomorrow's production of Canadians' oil. And out of tomorrow's oil, we will repay the principal and the interest and whatever else. So every single dollar we lend them, they've stolen. It was $140 billion this year. That's the financial capacity that Alberta has. We have the financial capacity to create $140 billion out of thin air at no cost to anyone. That's the value of the carbon we're digging up. That's $45,000 for every person in Alberta. Basic income we could have given had no cost to anyone. But what's happening is we let foreign shareholders not only control our production and take the real profits, we let them control the reserves that they don't own and they never paid us for. And that's true of the oil sands. There's 175 billion barrels of oil. Where's that big pile of money? Did somebody pay for that? We must have one hell of a savings account. No, there's no money.
yeah,
They
well,
were
it should be
given
going into
away.
the Heritage Fund at least, right? So that like we can you know
Where's the? There's no
something,
money. They never paid for it.
you know.
That's imperialism. They take your stuff gratis. That's imperialism. So in the 50s, the oil industry had zero debt. They couldn't borrow money. Nobody lent them since the 20s, since the great crash. They never borrowed any money. But in the 70s, they started borrowing money. Oil started to be collateral. You could start creating money out of thin air because of oil in the ground. It was a new thing. Never happened in the world.
Right.
That's why there's so much
From the
finance.
gold standard to the oil standard, right? Like
Yeah,
that.
was 1972 under Nixon. Yeah.
Yeah. And eventually, in 2003, all of our oil up here in Alberta became proven, became true. It was a financial asset starting in 2003. And so that was $9 trillion of new collateral that just appeared in 2003 in 6 license holders' pockets, had $9 trillion of new collateral they could lend to someone. And as soon as I lend it, they have to start paying me interest payments. I start making money. And so that's the giant crime at the heart of the austerity in Alberta. That's why times are tough. That's why we don't have healthcare, schools, that stuff is because the money come out of the ground. And that's what I've been struggling with ever since I started looking at how much money is coming out of the ground, where it's going. It doesn't make any sense. But if we can make that make sense, then set.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. There's an
voice.
economist, Mariana Mussato, Mazziato, maybe. Sorry, I'm really bad with
I know
names.
who you mean, yeah.
Yes, but she talks about how in the 70s we created like you're saying, the value extraction. That's how she describes it, as value extraction. So what you're describing is, rather than until the 70s, all the money that was made in our economy was fed back in through jobs and through infrastructure and through goods and through things that actually served us, right? Not to say that there weren't middlemen or middle people before that, but at least we had a system that every dollar went back into it. And what happened in the 70s is we just created value, like you're saying, and allowed that money to be returned to shareholders, to be taken out of the economy and given to individuals. And so that's the boom of our billionaire crisis, basically. And to your point, the people that can and should be ready to fund a whole new economy for not only Alberta, but for all of these regions. So I think like I'm just going to offer some reflections because I see we're close to the hour, and no rush or anything, but I'm just going to offer some things that I'm hearing and want to offer. So I agree with Alex. I think you and Mark and Albertans have a really big opportunity to acknowledge that we have all the pieces in place. We just need to expect the rules to be followed and the law to be upheld. And we just collectively need to come together and say, I don't care what it looks like, whether, as Alex said, it's a heritage fund, if it's a reclamation fund, if it's an orphan fund
Or
that's
both.
completely funded, or both or all three, whatever, like you said, Alex,
Yeah.
nothing has to be binary, whatever that looks like. It's the same bucket of money. It's the value of our assets. And it's time for us to actually start standing up for Albertans. And as you said, Alex, I just want to add, it isn't just about people in communities. This is about small companies, friends I know,
Yeah.
people that I know who owned wells and nearly lost their homes because they didn't understand what they were taking on because of this
Yeah.
being so casual, so flip about all this massive responsibility that's being handed off to them.
Sure.
Those
It's,
are my
the farmers up just in Big Hill Springs there,
Mhm.
who are they only make 15 cents on a bushel, but they have the opportunity to make 40 cents on a cubic meter of soil for gravel production. So try and convince a farmer that 15 cents is worth more than 40, and then all of a sudden his land is just gone. It's a big pit, right?
Yeah, we need that
Right.
context
And
for
we
people.
need that context for people, and and to to the taxation thing, and the speculative market, so to speak, like futures, right? Where they're like, oh, well, there's this many resources that we can tap in the future. So now that we've monetized what we can tap, we can borrow on that potential, right? And then just kind of run away after we exploited it, and everyone else can be kind of left with the bill. And when it came to taxation and roads and infrastructure and hospitalization, I hearken back to the president of El Salvador in one of his United Nations speeches, which I thought was actually really funny. He said, so the government says that you pay taxes to them so that they can build your roads and your hospitals and your everything, your infrastructure. But at the same time, they can print money out of thin air. So why are you paying taxes? You don't fund the government. They're self-funding.
Except it's going to corporations now, is right?
Because the governments are owned. See, and it was Mussolini who said, that fascism is not a proper definition of what's going on here. It is a government doing the bidding at the behest of private interests.
And
Right?
that is what's so poorly understood, is the incredible power of the government, the incredible capacity it has. It's just choosing not to. Like in Canada, in the 1930s, for the wrong reasons, the wrong people set up a central bank, the Bank of Canada, but it served a wonderful purpose. It created money out of thin air because we have a lot of resources and a whole economy that creates all sorts of value, that it's easy to tax a chunk off and just keep things rolling. And so for 50 years, the Bank of Canada financed all sorts of valuable things across Canada: infrastructure investment, healthcare, etc., until 1976. And for some reason, unexplained, undebated, and like a lot of these things, curiously unremarked, in 1976, the Bank of Canada stopped stopped lending money to provinces for healthcare, education, etc., because our financial capacity was going to be used elsewhere. It was going to be used to support the dollar in international trade. It was essentially going to be used to ship that financial capacity elsewhere, much like the financial capacity of the oil sands is used to lend money to American oil companies and to take that out. For 50 years now, our central bank has not used the central power of being sovereign. The whole point of this game, to be independent, to have our own banks and control, is so we could do something like have a bank that financed progress. For some reason, we stopped doing that 50 years ago. And
So
whatever
do
the
you think
reason
that's
for
like
that is,
This was a globalization type thing, like that happened post Second World War. It was like when it said like kind of economies and nations need to work together in free trade so that we can
Well,
up the standard of living through energy production. But then they discovered that it was cheaper to outsource labor to countries that maybe didn't charge as much or didn't have as many regulations in terms of workers' protections or unions or
that's part of it. That's
anything.
part of these local governments no longer representing the national interest of workers. It's serving a corporate interest or imperial interest, international compradors. They're not. It's not. Doesn't fit the logic of us. It doesn't serve 3 million Albertans. It fits a different sort of logic. And the problem is, our regulator doesn't have the right law. It's not operating by the right logic. And our governments, they don't share that same logic of the public interest, and they're serving the compradors serving different interests, and so it's
Hey,
expressed a lot
you
of
said
different
it.
ways.
Yeah.
You said the word
There we go.
comprador. Can you remind us what that is? Because I wrote it. I thought I wrote it down, but I didn't. Go ahead, remind us what a comprador is.
And so a comprador is someone who serves foreign business interests. So if you think about imperialism or Central America, and you have local businessmen serving British interests, or local politicians who may run things, but not entirely in the interest of the locals.
So is it a polite way of saying a treasonous? Is it
it's definitely impolite. It's not a nice thing. It is a betrayal. It is
It's treason.
very highly shunned upon for good reason. Treason, absolutely, and for good, and throughout history for good reason. Certain people have met terrible fates for such crimes, but I think it's a very useful concept for making sense of what's going on. Not everybody's stupid. There's a lot of money going around. There's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of benefit for playing dumb and serving those sort of interests, because you can't be honest about this. When you're serving those foreign interests, that's part of nothing makes sense, because they can't be honest, and that's when it comes down to rentiers, the people who share different interests. They can't be honest with us. That's the thing about rentiers that don't share the interests of labor or even capitalists. They can't participate in politics honestly. They can't tell you what they're doing. We live in a democracy. Them being honest about their 0.01% of interest they share with people, it just doesn't work. So
it's like when I hear politicians say this is, when someone brings this up, it's a threat to our democracy. Do they mean a threat to the people's democracy, or do they mean a threat to their internal democracy? What's going to affect their advantages? What's going to, like, are they speaking of the same democracy? I don't because I don't think they are.
That's the question.
Everybody should be asking themselves every time you hear someone speak. It's going to sound, and that's like when I started in university, every chapter I read, man, that's convincing. Yeah, that's it. And you read the next one. Oh, I'm totally convinced about that.
Yeah.
But
like I dropped out my third year in art college because I was in my humanities class, and it said in the textbook, accredited textbook, right? It said, note Rousseau's opinions on slavery, for he existed in a time when slavery existed, whereas nowadays it's abolished. And I was like, there's 45 million slaves right now. How can you possibly say that it doesn't exist? How can in an accredited educational manuscript say that slavery no longer exists, when I can just do a simple bit of research and say that is absolute nonsense? Right? And I had a temper tantrum with my counselor at college, and I was like, if this is what you're going to be teaching me, I'm out. I'm leaving.
And the reason there's so much of that, and the reason nothing can seem to be done about it, is because of those class interests that lay behind it. They don't have to make sense. They don't have to add up, but the interests aren't going anywhere. So you're not going to be. The force is still going to be coming. You have to recognize what it is, not what it's pretending to be. And then we have the numbers. We have the law. We have all of the advantages that would work in any sort of a fair fight. So what we need to strive to do is to make a system where there can be a fair fight, where people can get
Mm.
informed, debate, and decide for themselves. Where a system where a civil society group could affect a debate, could have an influence. Maybe sometime a corporation wouldn't win, wouldn't get everything. Maybe that those things aren't possible here in Alberta today. We've been trying.
Yeah. And I think the time is now. Like I can, so again, Regan, we want to make sure that this conversation reflects our real life conversation. So Regan, myself, and the rest of the Polluter Pay Federation are working hard with others to develop a future that we know that we can support and that we think is beneficial for all the stakeholders in this province. And so we're working on that. We've got some strategies in mind. Our community's growing, like Alex has said, and as Regan has said, the people are becoming more aware. And now is the time to do this as we're coming into awareness, as that veil is lifting, as you're describing.
The temperature is high, so there's reform coming, and we're not the only people trying to drive reform, and it doesn't all go in a good direction. And there's a lot of legislation being cooked up in Alberta today, and so we need to be vigilant. And but we have a few things in our back pocket. We have this charade of a regulatory system we could turn on them. We have an incredible system of law just waiting to be wielded, and we have more than enough money. And so there's great incentives to cut through the BS and make sense of things. It's tantalizing. It's a scary time, but it's tantalizing in the opportunities that things are in flux and people are upset and looking for change. And
hopefully more than spare change, maybe a few dollar bills in their pocket, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I think like everything that we've discussed, I can't really add too much to it yet, because like now I'm just stimulated. I've taken some notes, and then I'll do my own independent research. But I might like to just ask you, Regan, if anyone who happens to listen to this is interested in what you and the Polluter Pay Foundation are doing, or anything outside of that foundation are doing, where can they find you?
Well, probably the best way is on Twitter or X or whatever it's called.
Okay.
A number of us are active on there. I'm not sure Polluter Pay has a website at the moment, but you can
so
find
what's your
it
Twitter
there.
handle?
It's RKBTOO, RKB2.
RKB2.
And you can follow me there. I tweet about this stuff and keep up with the news there. And there's a network of folks like Jenny and others that sure love to connect with and meet more affected, knowledgeable people in the industry. We know they're everywhere, and we'd like to meet more of them and learn from more of them and start collaborating.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I think if any good message, Alex, if anybody's listening to this and you have a well on your property, you are concerned about your community, you want to make sure that there are jobs that are feel-good jobs that'll help us come together and actually do some effective things, please reach out to us. As Regan said, we're on Twitter. You can obviously reach us at thegravitywell.net, and we'll get you in touch with Regan if there's any investigative work or independent journalism that they're interested in as well. So again, thank you very much, Regan. Really appreciate talking to you. I'm sure there'll be more conversations with you and or the Polluter Pay Federation throughout the rest of the year. Thanks again.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.